All right, now it's recording after we've
Okay.
spent so much time talking about everything else other than storytelling.
Yeah.
Okay, welcome back, PD. Let
Thank
us
you.
let us get started with what was it you wanted to talk today about?
What about storytelling? Yeah. Ask me a question. Any question. Just
Okay,
to
so
set me up.
how long have you been a storyteller?
All right, that's a good one. Since about the early 80s. So I got interested in storytelling. Um, so you have to remember back in the day, this was still in the era of the cassette tape. You remember those? No?
I do.
Yeah.
I used to have a portable cassette player when I
A
was a little
portable
kid.
cassette player. Oh god. So
I
somebody gave
used
me
to
a tape.
listen in museums. I used to carry one around. I used to listen to it nonstop. And then my parents got me a portable CD player
Yeah, yeah,
with the
CDs came
really
along.
with the really big headphones on it.
Yeah, yeah, things always start out really big, don't they? They just get smaller and smaller. Um, so somebody gave me a cassette of a storyteller, and it was actually a guy. I think this is the guy. Yeah, it was a guy who was in a British hippie group called the Incredible String Band. But as that when that band was split, he started doing storytelling. So I was sort of quite intrigued to listen to this. So I listened to it, and one of the stories on it was quite. It moved me in the way that music can move you. At the end of this story, as it got towards the punch, you're quite taken in with the story, and as you get to the sort of punchline, you just think, "Ooh, wow, that's got some kind of power to it." So that interested me. So I started. I think actually that yeah, I did. I learned that story off by heart, so that I could then tell that story to other people, and they could get the experience of, oh, sometimes. But that's what's really interested me about storytelling was that sometimes, and I sometimes still get it for myself, when I'm telling a story, it will be quite unexpectedly that suddenly I'll start welling up. I'll start getting a lump in my throat, and I'll start getting, and I think obviously if I'm performing, I've got to like maybe not burst into tears, But
Got to keep it
although I
together.
sometimes thought that could be quite an effective thing to do, if people could actually see me describing a scene and there was tears streaming down my cheeks, they would sort of probably share that emotion much more likely than if I'm just sort of telling it. But anyway, um, so I started telling stories and I started looking around. I think for storytelling, for me anyway, well, for most people I should imagine, is what you've got to do is find a story that you want to tell, right? And then you tell it in your own way. But telling it in your own way is interesting because in modern storytelling, a lot of the sort of the popular idea. I mean, sorry, I should explain that storytelling is a tiny little world of its own. A lot of people, you'd say, I'm a storyteller. I say to people sometimes, I do storytelling, and they'll say, "Oh, so you read stories to children from a book? Is that what you do?" I said, no, it's not at all what I do. No, no. But that's what storytelling is to most people. A storyteller opens a book and reads to the little children once upon a time in a land far away. And that's what storytelling is. But so that is not what storytelling is within the storytelling community. But it's like, so these modern storytellers, they don't memorize, and they say that every telling of a story should be different, and it should be nuanced towards the setting, the type of audience you've got, how drunk they are, or how old they are, or whatever, all these things, and it would always be different. And I sort of think that is actually a lie, because I listen to some of these storytellers tell a story, and then at the end of it, they say, "Oh, I've got some cassettes for sale if you'd like to sort of." So I think, "Oh, yeah, I'll buy a cassette." So I buy the cassette and go home. I listen to the cassette, and they tell the story exactly on the cassette like they told it to the audience at the performance, right? So maybe that's just how they've ended up doing it. But what I thought was, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut to the chase. I'm going to compose the perfect telling of a story because I don't want it to sort of say the first time I tell a story, well, I didn't really know it very well, and I wasn't really sure how to tell this bit, so I kind of bumbled and fumbled my way through it. That's crap. People are going to have a crap experience. So I work out the best way to put something, to phrase it, learn it, and then give it to it. So it's going to be a good performance from performance one. Okay, it won't need any fine tuning, not much anyway. So this idea, I think, is a kind of like a kind of romanticized, folksy idea that everything is always a different kind of thing. I guess it's like people think you can tell a story like you can tell a joke. If I told you a joke, you could turn around to the person next to you and tell that joke because it's kind of fairly easy, fairly simple, and you can do it. But you can't really either. You can, maybe you could do it with a story. Maybe other types of storytellers could do it, but I can't do that. So I tend to compose a kind of text, and I do learn it off by heart. Now that to a lot of storytellers would be heresy. You memorize your stories. Yes, I do. I memorize my stories, but I know when I tell the story that it's going to be a good telling of it. It's going to be on the nail. You know, that's how I do it. It's interesting in America. I used to go to storytelling clubs when I lived in England, and a lot of people. One person I spoke to, he said, "Oh, I've just come back from America," and he said, "I've done." I said, "I went to a few storytelling clubs in America," and I said, "Oh, well, that's really interesting. So, what's it like?" And he said, "It's very different indeed." And I said, "Well, what in what way?" And he said, "Well, they don't tell traditional stories like we do." And I said, "Well, what do they tell then?" And he said, "Well, they kind of tell personal anecdotes." And he said, I said, "Right, okay." So he said, in fact, I overheard one person when I've been chatting to these people, and they sort of say, "Oh, he overheard two American storytellers say to each other, you know, that British guy, said, in Britain, you know what they do? They tell traditional stories." And the other storyteller went, "Oh God, no! What you mean, like Cinderella? And well, not like yeah, but yeah, folk story. Oh God, magic stories. Oh God." So they like. It seems to be that the main thing in America seems to be personal anecdotes. And I got a tape. I got another cassette tape of these, and they're very funny. They're very interesting and entertaining. But it seems to be the thing that's what Americans want to do. Have you heard of that blues musician, Seasick Steve?
See, Steve?
Seasick,
D6
as in
Steve. The
not heard
name's
of him.
familiar. The
Right.
name.
Okay. Well, I got one of his CDs because I like blues based sort of music, and he at the end of one of his CDs, he just starts off on this ramble telling this story about how when he was a young boy, a hippie in the '60s in California, he'd heard that if you pretended that you were a Canadian, they'd ship you straight. They'd put you on a plane and send you back to Canada. And he thought, hey, I could get a free flight to Canada. I'll just go and tell them I'm Canadian. I need to get home. So he went and told them they're Canadian. They put him on a flight, but it went south to Mexico, where he found himself in this kind of like detention center for illegal immigrants. And he was stuck there for about 2 or 3 weeks. And he thought, what the hell's going on? And eventually, what happened was he realized that he thought, God, I'm just going to be here for ages. So he went and told them the truth. He said, I'm American as apple pie, and I was just trying to get a free flight to Canada, and I'm sorry. And the police came and took him out. But during that few weeks he was there, he noticed that there was this Haitian bloke. Every day, the guards would come and they'd walk him out a couple of 100 yards beyond the gate, and they'd turn around and walk him back again. And then he said, and I asked him about that guy, and they said, well, he's got no passport, so he's got no nationality, so we can't deport him anywhere. So he's been here for 13 years. And he said, no. So I got out of that place, and he said, I think about that guy sometimes, and I'm just glad I'm just out of that place. So that's the end of the story. And I think that's the kind of personal anecdote that it makes a good yarn, it makes a good tale. But the stories that tend to get told in Britain are sort of like traditional stories, folk stories, old stories. But the types of stories I'm in, and that kind of folksy type, what I call a folksy style of telling, is just somebody telling a story in a quite natural way. Like you'd sit down and say, well, once there was this man who lived in a forest and blah 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 blah. But the kind of tales I'm interested in telling are more. I do tell ghost stories and horror stories and things like that, but I'm also interested in telling myths and epics and heroic sort of tales. And they don't suit a folksy kind of style. I think you need a kind of more elevated style. And that's why I like to try and recreate what it must have been like to listen to a storyteller in Anglo-Saxon or Norse times, or the Ainu, whatever. And so a lot of my stories, I'll actually use narrative verse recently. This is something I've developed only fairly recently. But I realized, of course, that the original function of poetry was just to tell a story. You would never get the kind of poetry like romantic poetry or whatever, where you're talking about your internal state or having an internal dialogue with yourself. That kind of inward looking. It would just be serve a narrative verse function. And I started telling these stories, and people seem to like them. It's odd though, because people aren't used to listening to stories now. So if they're familiar with that scene, they know to sit down and they'll shut up and they'll listen to you. But sometimes, like people would say to me, like youth workers would say to me, "Will you come and tell stories to my teenagers?" I think, oh God, that's like going to be the worst audience imaginable, a load of teenagers. So I'll go in and I'll sit down and I'll start telling a story. And then this kid right in the front row, he just sort of pulls open a packet of crisps and starts munching them. And you hear all this crackling of the crisp packet. I think it's quite difficult to concentrate over this crackling. And I thought he's actually making quite a lot of noise. And then he pulls out a can and you go, psst. And I said, I had to stop it and just say, sorry, mate. I said, I'm sorry, but I'm not a video. I'm actually a human being. I can't concentrate with all this crackling and slurping going on. And he went, oh. So I carry on with the story for a bit. And then another kid suddenly says to me, "Are you telling a joke?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, what are you doing?" I said, "I'm telling a story. It's not a joke." "No, it's not. Is it going to be funny at the end?" I said, "No, not really." And he couldn't kind of get his head around what I was actually doing. That I was just actually telling the story. So people aren't used to it. And like I say, that woman who said, "Oh, you read stories to children from a book," so it's kind of quite difficult. But what interests me about storytelling is, and this is something that I've kind of researched about storytelling, is that when you and it would apply to the ancient cultures that I'm interested in trying to recreate those stories as best you can in the modern age, is that when you read a book, you are reading silently to yourself. And at any point as you read that text, you can stop and you can think objectively about it. You can think, well, that doesn't make sense, but or this person's really a bit funny. This character's a bit odd, or that's the. But when you're listening to an oral story, you haven't got time to stop and pause and reflect upon what you've just read. You're just carried along with it, a bit like when you watch a film, more like when you watch a film. So all these people that are listening together, they're all having a shared experience. You don't get time to think. You just have to listen, and words pour into your ears in a way that that a written text does not pour in, because you can stop and say and be critical about it. But it tends to be more when you're all sharing the same story. It encourages everybody to identify with the characters in that story because you're all listening together, especially if they are characters that you share a culture with. If it's Hindu people listening to a Hindu epic, they're all sharing that culture. So they all tend to identify with, and they all share the emotions of that. So you have a shared sort of communal experience. That's why I think storytelling is, you can call it a participatory experience. This was another thing I came across in the early days of storytelling. People would be say that storytelling should be participatory, that the audience is as much as part of it as you are, the storyteller. So when you're telling to children, you'd get them to join in with call and response things, or you'd get them to do a little dance. If the people in the story are having a dance, you get them to do a little dance. But actually, with a purely oral culture, the participation is deeper than that, because the audience is sharing the emotions that the character is experiencing. But when you've got a literate culture, so this is what used to, it well still does interest me, the transition between a purely oral culture and a literate culture. When you've got a literal culture, you can then get down to you could read a novel where the central character is completely dull and boring. But in oral cultures, the characters are always larger than life. They're really strong. They're really beautiful. They're really evil. Whatever it is about them, it's big, it's bad. It's larger than life. And these characters are kind of like the characters that like bring the oral story cultures together. But in a modern, say, like a Charles Dickens novel, you can have all these horrible little characters. Charles Dickens characters, some of them are just like, you just think these people are just horrible, horrible people. But that's what a literate culture can do. And you don't identify with those characters. You don't share in their emotions when they're being nasty and greedy and grasping and horrible. You don't share and thinking, yeah, 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 get that money, exploit that child, do it, do it, do it. You don't share those emotions. But but in an oral culture where the hero is bravely battling the dragon or whatever, you share and think, come on, go for it, go for it. Oh, he's going to kill the dragon. And that's what I like about it. It is told face to face. When COVID came along, suddenly, of course, you couldn't have face to face storytelling. So people started doing Zoom storytelling, which, okay, it's better than nothing, because you just sat at home. You can't go out. You can't go for a walk. You can't do anything. But I realized very quickly that I thought, this isn't the same. This isn't the same. It's like the difference between watching a film and watching a play in a theatre. When you go to a theatre, there's a kind of a buzz, there's an atmosphere, because you know that any minute now, real people are going to walk out there and they're going to start doing this play. And you're thinking things could go wrong. But the interaction, the immediacy of those characters in front of you playing those parts is much more powerful and emotional experience than just watching something that has been filmed thousands of miles away and is now been produced and copied and sent to your cinema. So that's what interests me about storytelling, really. Trying to recreate those kind of ancient stories and give people an idea of what it's like. Interestingly, like a lot of Norse stories are set in a hall. So the king is in his hall, and a stranger comes to the door one night, and the stranger walks in through the door and says, "Oh, my name's so and so," and this creates what scholars have called a double scene, because the audience that's listening to this storyteller telling this story is also sitting in a hall. So there is a kind of like a merging between the mythic hall and the actual hall that they're set in. They can relate to the story because they're sat in a hall, just like the characters in the story are sat in a hall. And they can, yeah, you get what's called a double scene, and the audience will become aware that, of course, they are sat in a hall just like the characters are sat in a hall. Often I end up telling stories in places which are not conducive to any kind of atmosphere at all. They're sort of they're kind of like community rooms that have got lino floors, plastic chairs, and strip lighting, and it's horrible. So what I like to do quite often, where I can, and this actually arose more. I've always told stories outside, but it started happening more and more during COVID, because I thought, well, actually, people probably feel more comfortable about coming to an event from a COVID point of view if it's outside. So I've told stories in sand dunes, in woods, different places, outdoors, in fields. Round a campfire is best, of course, because the fire would have been, again, it's another sort of mythic element which is usually in a story. People would
Yeah,
have been dependent
especially when you
on.
can burn incense or you can put
Yeah,
music on too.
yeah. I've done that actually. I like burning incense, so I sort of use incense to just to help create a little bit more atmosphere. I also use. I'm not a musician, but I can play a few simple tunes on a lyre, so which is the kind of bardic instrument that people would have used in sort of like the Dark Ages, as so called. And I like to just at points of pathos or tension or tragedy, just use the lyre just to sort of give it a bit of an extra sort of dimension. Um, and that's what I like to do. Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah, that yeah, storytelling is really fun. I hang out with like I do go to a lot of like pagan and heathen and Wiccan and whatever the
Mm-hmm.
names might be for events and get-togethers, and then I have some Native American friends, and I go to theirs, and it's interesting to see for the Wiccan and pagan events, the get-together. It's interesting to see the mix of people from like young and old all interested in this event, and there's not really a lot of storytelling to be had in it.
Oh, really?
Um,
Right.
yeah, like nobody is coming in and reciting any myths, which would be really fun. I'd partake. I'd
Yeah.
partake in being the storyteller. Um,
Yeah.
but then, with native events, like people are always like so willing to tell stories, talk about the story, some a story of an ancestor or somebody in the group, or they'll talk about one of their myths and legends about an animal, or a social fire, or one of their myths with the creator, and people are just so latched into it and so invested. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. That's what. Yeah. Yeah.
do you
That's
think
what I've
that
always. Go on. Sorry.
do you think that in recreating uh, how people would have told stories, do you think some of these tales, some of these epics or poems that would be a part of some of the ceremonies at certain times of the year?
I would imagine. I would think so. I mean, there isn't any sort of direct evidence for that, but you kind of think, yeah, a lot of stories. I mean, there's one story, it's a Celtic story, called the Story of Angus and Bride, and it's one of those stories which Victorian anthropologists love because it fitted very neatly into their theory that all myths were actually were just sort of like personalizations. That all the characters in in myths were just personifications of natural forces. Um, so so this is a story about a young girl who's captured by a terrible winter witch. She's the queen of winter, and Angus, the young god of summer, he comes along and he sees her and he realizes he's got to rescue this poor maiden, and he fights this witch. And it's really like a personification of the weather that we're experiencing now in Scotland. The spring weather is, you know, sometimes Angus will come along and it's beautiful sunshine, and you think winter's over, you know, winter's on her way out, bye bye. And then suddenly she'll build it up and then no, I'm fucking not over, and come flying back. And the next day you think, I mean, we had 21-degree temperatures last week, and now it's down to about 6 again. So there's this battle going on between the forces of winter and summer, and of course eventually summer will naturally win, and of course eventually Angus gets his bride, so there are those types of stories that you think would have been told around this time of year, um, or on Breedog's Night, which in the modern calendar, as it from our previous talk, we don't actually know when Breedog's Night was. It's probably a lunar festival originally, but now it's on the 31st of January, Breedog's Night. So they tell that story then, but not all stories fit into a cycle of nature, which is probably what a lot of Wiccans would like. Stories for Lammas, stories for Halloween, stories for you can tell ghost stories at Halloween. There is evidence though that or in some sagas, I can't remember which ones there were now, but there's sagas where storytellers would tell the story of something before on the eve of a battle. And it's that shared experience where basically it's not simply a question of inciting the warriors to be as brave as the heroes in the story were the next day when they go to sleep, listen to the story, wake up and think, remember that story we heard last night? Right, let's fucking kill them all, and then charge off into battle. But it's about sharing that experience and I suppose it's a shared commonality of experience where you'd share not just the need the you're going to go through what they went through and look how well they did, but you're sharing that common. You're part of a mythic world almost, like as a warrior. Um, so there is evidence that they would be using it before particular occasions, like the eve of battles. You know, the stories. One of the most interesting stories I like is a story about a storyteller who goes to the court of Olaf Tryggvason, who was an evangelizing king of Norway, and he comes in and he explains, says, "Oh, can I stay?" And he says, "You can stay all winter. I'm not going to turn anybody out at this time of year. It's getting too bad. You might die out there, so you can stay all winter." So this stranger explains that he's a storyteller and he starts telling stories. Now he starts telling mythical stories, the king doesn't like it because those are stories about gods and goddesses. So he tells him to stop. We don't want any more of those kinds of stories, thank you. So he just tells stories about battles and warriors and things like that. But then he says the king gets given a present, a gold ring, and he gives him this gold ring, and he shows it around to everybody and says, "What a beautiful ring I've been given." And the stranger looks at it and says, "It's all right." And people say, "Well, have you ever seen better gold than that?" And he said, "Well, yes, I have. I've got it here." And he produces a broken saddle buckle. And the king says, "Well, I have to admit, this gold is much finer than the gold on my ring. So where did you get it from?" And he says, "Well, I got it from Sigurd, the dragon slayer." And he said, "Well, tell us the story of how you got it from Sigurd the dragon slayer." So he tells the story of how he got it from Sigurd the dragon slayer. And when he's finished telling the story, there's just a silence because everybody knows that Sigurd died about 300 years ago. So how can he possibly be alive? So then the king says to him, "But Sigurd died 300 years ago. So how can what you have said just possibly be true?" And he said, "Okay, I'll tell you the story of how it's true." And he tells this story of how when he was born, these three strange women came to his chieftain father's house and told him, there's a long, I won't go into the whole thing, but it's basically one of them cursed him and said, I don't like this baby. The other two liked the baby. The other one didn't like the baby for some reason, or she was embarrassed, or she was upset. And she said, "I'm laying a curse on this baby. This baby will die when this candle burns out. When this candle that's lit here, when it's burnt out completely, he'll die." So he's got about an hour or so before he'll die. So one of the older prophetesses, spay women that come to speak people's futures at babies' births, blows it out and says, "Now the boy will live forever because this candle will never burn out because it's been blown out unless it's relit." Yeah. So he's going to live forever. So that's how he lives forever. And he says, "I've still got the candle." And of course, Olaf, being a Christian, says, "Well, this is all just heathen magic. So I'm going to light the candle and we'll see if you die." "You won't die. And if you don't die, will you accept baptism in Christ's name? Because it's God who decides when we die, not strange old women, So the candle burns out. Now, in the original saga, of course, being the saga of Olaf Tryggvason, the great king who converted Norway to Christianity, the candle burns out. The stranger doesn't die. He accepts baptism and dies a Christian. Hooray! A happy ending. But of course, I couldn't do it. I couldn't tell it like that, and I couldn't resist the drama of the alternative ending, which is that, of course, he lights the candle burns out, and then the stranger is just sat there. But what nobody realizes is he's dead. So somebody goes up to him and shakes his shoulder, and he topples over, and they realize that the magic worked. Which brings me on to an interesting point about how traditional stories can't have. I mean, I've changed it deliberately. I read it. I didn't receive that as part of an oral tradition. I read it in a book and I adapted it for my own purposes, obviously. But it's very interesting. In Beowulf, it briefly mentions that Sigmund killed Fafnir the dragon, And in Volsunga Saga, it's his son Sigurd that kills the dragon. Now, to a modern sensibility, to a modern mind, they're just going to look at these two contradictory things. Well, who killed the dragon then, Sigmund or Sigurd? So they're going to look at this and they're going to think, well, which is the true version? Which is the original version? But of course, in an oral culture, you don't have an original text that you can go back to the oldest text and look at it and say, ah, this is the oldest text. It was Sigmund that killed the dragon, so this one's wrong. Both in an oral culture, both versions have equal validity because there is no original story. But you do wonder how these stories get changed. But I imagine that because traditional storytellers are learning things, just passing it down through generations, there is this thing called a kind of creativity that they have. They don't create new stories. They just rework old traditional stories. And sometimes they might change little things which aren't important in the great scheme of things. As long as the dragon dies, it was one of the Volsungs that killed the dragon. That's definite. That's the common truth in both versions. And they look at these things and just think, I want to emphasize in this story this aspect of the story. I don't want to talk about. I mean, I did it recently with a story about the Deesir. There's a story in Iceland where these people. It's a Christianized, it's an evangelizing story where these Deesir spirits, the spirits of the dead ancestors, female ancestors, are going to move out. They're going to leave. But I tell the story, and it's told from the story point of view of a man who has got the second sight, but he can see with his second sight that Christianity is coming and that these spirits will be leaving. But I tell the story from the point of view of the spirits that are going to be leaving, and I sort of and the story is that they get their revenge. Basically, what happens is the Deesir spirits kill the main protagonist's youngest best son. They kill him on the night of Deesir Blot, which was the full moon of the third new moon before the winter solstice. They kill him, and he's found dead in the morning. And they recite he's still alive. He tells his tale, and then he dies. And this bereaved man, turns to his friend who's got second sight and says, "What the hell's gone on? What has gone on here? Why is my son being killed by these women?" And he says, and he uses his second sight, and he tells him, and he says, they killed your son because they see that soon a new religion will come to this land, and you will be one of the first converts. And from that point on, your children will go to church, and your children won't be holding, and your descendants thereafter won't be holding any more Deesir blots in honor of the ancestors. And it hasn't happened yet, but they're dead, and they can see what's going to happen in the future. And they took your son as tribute and vengeance. So I tell it from their side of the story. So I'm putting a different slant on the same story. It's the same narrative, but the theme is different. And that's how I think changes can come about in oral stories. But you'll never find out which was the original correct one. Never, never.
Yeah. Do you think too, in these oral traditions and these stories, there's a lot of information provided? Like when the sun kills the dragon, do you think that is more so of a little bit of information being put in as like a rite of passage for a young warrior?
What you mean? Do you think it's kind of like a mythic paradigm of what a warrior has to go through? That it has to go through a baptism of fire, basically. Is
Yeah.
that what you mean? Yeah, yeah. I think so. I think that's it's holding up paradigms of what a warrior should be, I suppose. I mean, it's quite interesting with that dragon slaying in the Volsunga saga, because he doesn't go and meet the dragon head on, face to face, in a great like Beowulf does. Beowulf goes out there with like a metal shield that will hopefully last a bit longer than a wooden one would against the fire breathing dragon. And he's going out there and he's just getting burnt, and he's getting and he's getting caught. He gets caught up in the dragon's fangs, and he's lifted up into the air by the dragon, and he can feel the poison seeping into his body. And at the last minute, he just remembers he's got a sax knife in his belt, so he just pulls it out, manages to stick the dragon, and it's a great story. Sigurd, the great Germanic hero, what does he do? He works out that the dragon goes down from its cave to the river every night to drink. So he digs a ditch across the path, hides in the ditch, and when the dragon goes over, he just sticks it in the belly. Not exactly very heroic, but very clever. He didn't get burnt.
He did not get burnt or poisoned. Didn't
Or
get poisoned
poisoned.
either.
No, no. Some of the blood, of course, fell on his back, and that's the. Oh no, I think he washed. What did he do? I think he washed himself in the blood, so he would be invulnerable to wounds. But there was one bit on his back that he couldn't quite reach, so that was eventually the point where he got the spear through his back. But so yeah, so that's interesting. It wasn't a heroic battle, but it was showing that a warrior needs to use tactics and strategy and cleverness as well as just be strong and brave. So
Okay.
yeah, I think they do show different things. That some of them don't. Some of them you sort of think some of the mythic stories that involve the gods and goddesses. They're very very strange. I mean, obviously you have creation myths and destruction myths, but other stories in between, they're just kind of like they show a kind of struggle between the Jotnir, which I noticed Scott said is a really good point to make, that the Jotnir, which always gets translated as giants, aren't actually any bigger than gods or humans. So I think that's a really good point. I think I'll probably try and start just calling them Jotnar right now, or a Jotun, rather than calling them giants. But those stories kind of show up power struggles between two groups of people. But modern scholars can look at these groups and think, like Scott was saying, were the giants another tribe? Were they a different set of gods? It's very difficult to tell. But
Yeah.
what I find fascinating is that I'm fascinated by these stories, and that other people, once they actually get down to sit and listen to them and hear them, they're fascinated by them too. And in a way, it doesn't really matter that you can't analyze it to death and say what it means. It's just enough that you actually get gripped and get involved in these sort of stories.
Yeah.
What interested me about the going back to talking about how I memorize stories, was the thing called the Homeric question, which was that I think as early as there was in the 18th century, there was an English, he was a diplomat, and he was what they called in those days an antiquarian. So he's like an amateur archaeologist. And he said that he thought that Homer wasn't literate, that he wasn't a literate person, that his poem was not the poem of a literate person. Which at the time, I think that idea was probably poo-pooed, because Homer was seen as the genius of classical poetry. His poet, the Iliad and the Odyssey were brilliant. And then in the early 20th century, along come two American scholars called Albert Lord and Milman Parry, and they started doing early recordings of Yugoslavian singers. And they came to realize, and when they analyzed those recordings of Yugoslavian storytellers, they began to realize that what was happening was that these storytellers, who would say to them afterwards, when I tell this story, it's the same, it's word for word, but they could tell it wasn't word for word. And what was happening was that they were using formulas for particular events. So there'll be particular words and word forms and word groups that would express certain ideas or themes over and over again. So whatever story you were telling, if there was a feast in it, they would start to use these formulaic phrases about how big a feast was. So for example, like for modern people, we might say, the tables were groaning with food. There was so much food, the table, you could hear the tables creaking, and the wine was flowing like water. These kind of effective but kind of very formulaic kind of things. And he said they would use these, they would have kind of a storehouse, a memory of these kind of formulaic phrases, um, which they repeatedly drew upon for different things. So he said, but to a modern sensibility, they're cliches. You know, the tables are groaning with food, the water was running like wine. But why are they so good? Why did everybody love Homer's poem so much if they're just a battery of cliches? Because this is what these scholars realized that Homer was doing. He was using a set of stock phrases over and over again. Um, and it's because what they call the oral noetic, not poetic, the oral noetic thought depended on noetic thought is to do with the rational and intellectual faculties of the mind. And these depend on formulas which would have to be effective or they wouldn't be memorable. So they have to be really good phrases, really good turns of phrase. And because they're memorable turns of phrase, and also because it's all written in poetry, they're tied to certain rules of alliteration. So that will tend to preserve those formulas, alliteration and rhythm. Then you have a narrative and the mode of expression are both made very memorable. And that's how these storytellers, oral storytellers, a lot of them would tell stories. They would tell them using these. They It's very difficult for us as illiterate people to imagine being in a culture where there isn't any writing. All you do is hear stories, but you would hear these phrases over and over again. So whether it's a feasting theme or a fighting theme or whatever it is, you've got a battery of 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 really good turns of phrase that you can bring in to make your poetry sound really, really good. But they're not your phrases. They're not your original work. And of course, this when Milman Parry and Albert Lord wrote this book and demonstrated that Homer was actually an oral formulaic poet. It just so happened that his work got written down and his text, that one telling or whatever, that version was preserved in writing. Um, that he wasn't a genius. He was just a traditional storyteller. That's all he was. And it's exactly the same with Beowulf. But Beowulf just came from an oral tradition. At some point, it happened to get written down. It happened to get preserved. But when you read it as a narrative poem, you can see that it's employing, swords. Swords are never just swords. They're always flames of battle. And it goes on and on and on like that. So that's how it works. So this was a big deal at the time because, of course, Homer was idealized by centuries of educated people, sort of both in America and in Europe as a genius, as a poet. But of course, to a modern sensibility, a poet is somebody or a writer is he they're what characterizes them as good is their originality, their individuality. They're not like any other writer, but actually oral poets are kind of like all the same. They all use this rich formulas. And it just so happens that Homer's is one of the few that survived, so he stands out. But if you could go back to ancient Greece and hear Homer telling the story of the Iliad, and then go across to another Greek island and hear another story telling the story of the Iliad, you'd think they're both just as good. It's because it's a great story. It's a great story. It's not the teller, it's the story. And that's the story of oral formulaic poetry, how it was discovered that they don't learn words, they don't learn stories word for word like I do. They learn them in a different kind of way. They have a different kind of memory. So it's very interesting, that contrast between the oral and the literate mindset. I can't learn stories like that because I'm not in a position to be able to go and listen to all these stories from childhood right through up to adulthood and picking up these stories. I have to kind of try and recreate it from what's left, the literature that's left in books, and I can recreate it that way. And I can rewrite my versions in poetic form and create those rhythms and those alliterations and hopefully those memorable phrases to make it a more authentic sort of telling or retelling of the story. Because the sad thing is, apart from maybe in Scotland, you have a few traveling people um, who do have a sort of, maybe I think probably it's fair to say they do have an unbroken tradition of storytelling, of kind of folksy storytelling. But storytelling is not a survival; it's a revival. Unlike folk music, which is just about hung on as a continuous tradition of people learning to play tunes, whether it's sort of Irish folk music or sort of English folk music, Scottish folk music. I think Dutch folk music nearly disappeared. Dutch folk music nearly disappeared. It actually, people had nearly stopped playing it. You could not go anywhere. You'd be hard pushed to find anywhere where you could go to a Dutch folk club and hear Dutch folk music. But just as it was about to die out, they suddenly realized and said, hang on, this is going to die. When was the last time you heard any folk music? Come on, we've got to get this thing going. So they managed to just bring it back from the dead just as it was about to die. But with storytelling, for most cultures, literate cultures, it's died out. So people are now reviving and recreating it and trying to make it authentic, and for the most part it does do, but it's not a survival, it's a revival. Sometimes people say, oh, it's always survived since time immemorial. No, it hasn't. It died out. People stopped telling these stories, but it is a revival, but it is successful because it does recreate that experience of storytelling, the face to face, mouth to mouth kind of experience of, I'm sat here, you're sat there, I'm telling a story, or you remember that you're listening to it, you're involved in it. It's that kind of immediate experience. It's I heard some stories. People started telling stories on the telly a few decades ago. It's kind of not the same because it's still a face staring at you out of the screen. And every now and again, they couldn't resist doing a few sound effects or putting in a few images or pictures or whatever. Um, it's not the same, but I think, yeah, there's storytelling clubs around Britain. I'm in a group called the Grampian Association of Storytellers. So we're a local group. Most of them are based in Aberdeen, but we're most of them in Aberdeen or in the Grampian region of Aberdeenshire. And they'll put on events and try and organise things, get storytelling a bigger audience. But by and large, I still think it's quite a small niche. It's a niche. It's a niche market, storytelling, as yet. I don't know if it would ever become kind of more mainstream. I don't think it would become mainstream uh, because it is dependent upon being face to face, and more people nowadays just want everything to be online because it's just easy. I mean, people aren't even printing magazines anymore because you just get the magazine online. So even in literate culture, it's all still online. So the idea of, and again, as I say, sort of storytelling on a Zoom doesn't work as well to me as the actual living experience. And that's what's special. And I think as people seem to be getting more and more alienated from each other. I mean, I was talking to my friend who's got sort of young children in their 20s, and she was saying a lot of them are sort of, they don't talk to their friends. They'll message their friends, or they'll send them a taped message, and then they'll get a taped message back. So they're not even actually having a phone conversation anymore. And I think that kind of that personal interaction seems to be disappearing. But storytelling in its original form would be something that would bring people together as a communal, shared activity.
Is there anything you'd suggest for people to start telling stories?
Yeah, well, find a story that you like, find a story that speaks to you. Um, it might be because you find it funny or because you find it scary or whatever. And I mean, again, like a lot of people would disapprove of this, but you might find a story, you might think, I'll just learn it off by heart, right? If that story speaks to you the way it's told, why not learn it off by heart? But to a lot of people that think, oh God, I can't learn a whole story. Well, yes, you can, but it's making the effort. But if you don't want to do it that way, then you need to, I kind of guess, find the story, work out the bare bones of it. This happens, then that happens, then that happens, then the end happens. And then you kind of work out how you want to say it. And then what you should do is rehearse it, and then rehearse it some more, and then rehearse it some more until you can say that story in a kind of stream of consciousness, non-stop, without faltering, without stumbling, without stuttering, without pausing. Oh, what's the next bit? Oh shit! Oh yeah, yeah, I know, because that's no good. That's not going to impress an audience. If you start sort of going, oh shit, I can't. Oh yeah, sorry, it's okay. It's only a split second, but it still kind of breaks that narrative flow. So you need to over rehearse it, because what the thing that struck me the first time I told stories was that you learn all these stories, you learn this story in your head, and you say to people one day at a party or just a gathering or whatever, or say, "Would you like me to tell a story?" And you explain to people what you want to do. They're like, "Oh yeah, well, yeah, okay, well, let's all sit down and listen to a story." So everybody gets a drink and they all sit down by the fire and I tell the story. And suddenly, boom, everybody's staring at me. Of course they are. I'm the only person speaking, but it's actually kind of quite intimidating because everybody's staring at you. When I don't know about you, but when I read a book or listen to a story on the radio or whatever, um, in my head, I see images of the characters and the action that's going on, and and I was doing that when I was learning these stories. I think then Thor got hold of his hammer and he split the giant. I've seen this fantastic image of the hammer going into Thor's, the hammer going into the Jotnir's, and head shattering all over the place. And that's great. And I thought, actually, I'll use that because that's another thing about storytelling is that you can use gesture and action. So when Thor's hammer hits the giant, so you can actually go, and that sound is actually like a very toned down version of what it would actually be like when a heavy blunt object hits an equally blunt heavy head.
Crack skull open.
It cracks the skull open. Another one, a good one, is like when somebody hits somebody with a fist. You can actually hit your own palm with your other fist, and that makes them, and suddenly you just hit him. So you can use gestures. You might want to rehearse it. You might want to think about how you're going to do that. Maybe you might want to jump up and jump around. You can make it kind of because when you're a storyteller, you're also a bit of an actor, and that's another interesting aspect of storytelling is that sometimes when a character in a story uses direct speech, you should become that character. So it's no good saying, and then Thor said that he was going to smash that giant's head to pieces. That's no good. You've got to say, and then Thor said, I am going to smash your head to pieces. You become Thor for that split second. I'm going to smash your head to pieces. That's how you do it. You don't say, and then Thor said, I'm going to smash your head to pieces. You can't just say it as you would say it. You've got to say it like Thor would say it. You've got to try and be that character. So that's the advice I would give to people. Try and think. In fact, somebody once said to me that they'd said, "Oh, oh, you tell stories, don't you? I'd like to hear you tell stories because one of my friends was a storytelling that you did, and they said that when you started telling a story, your personality changed." And I said, "Oh, that's interesting." But then when I thought about it afterwards, I thought, actually, I do. When I start to tell a story, I adopt the persona of a storyteller. I become the storyteller, and I think that's the important thing to do. You've got to kind of command that space, and that's the advice I would give people. Try and think about how you're going to do it, not just speak it, but the intonation of your voice, the rhythm. You can speed up bits, you can slow down bits, you can whisper bits, you can use the entire voice range, you know, of from a whisper to a shout to a scream or whatever, and gestures, actions, and over rehearse it. And actually, what I started doing from then on was when I'm learning a story, I will actually close my eyes and instead of visualizing the action of the story, I will visualize lots of people staring at me. And some of them will be picking their nose, and others will be whispering to their friend, and all the kind of off-putting others will be going, oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. Doing things like that. All the things that audiences will sometimes do that can put you off, and try and visualize it because that's what's going to come at you when you're actually telling the story. to a live audience. So that's my advice. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, PD.
Okay.